Chapter 3, First Contact. It was freezing outside. The snow-riddled ground turned Arissa's skin a lighter color. Flint had been at the forefront for auto manufacturing since 1855, and as the plague spread, it seemed the obvious place to form a community to establish transportation capacity and use the Great Lakes and rivers as natural barriers against the undead. This is where Arissa had been given her jeep. By now, Fate had been able to read Arissa's facial expressions fairly easily and saw a regrettably familiar look in her face with the smirk she wore. There was a huge wall of cement barriers that stretched as far as I could see, and a gate made of solid steel that could only be opened from the inside. As we stood there, the gate began to open. We grabbed our bags from the jeep and walked through the gate into a courtyard of sorts with yet another large square, flat area, about 2,000 square feet. On the opposite side of the square, there was another smaller gate, about the size of a diesel truck, also heavily fortified. Next to it was a small phone with no dialing numbers and a small unlit red light. Arissa said to Fade, "Take off your clothes." I was a little hesitant, but did as I was told. Arissa did the same. It was a long time since Fade saw a woman. She then told Fade, "Do exactly as I do. We are being watched." Arissa and Fade held their arms out and turned slowly in a circle. They continued to do this until the phone's red light flashed at them. Arissa hastily ran over to the phone and picked it up. "Hello," she said. "We are here to see Rock. We have information about the plague." She hung up the phone and told Fade to put his clothes back on. The smaller gate opened and the two entered the city of Flint. The empty streets of Flint is not what Fate expected. No people. And who had Arissa talked to on the one-way phone? Arissa had clearly been to Flint before. She grabbed Fade's hand and pulled him alongside her as she moved towards a large industrial building directly. The couple went inside and through a metal access door down some stairs. Explosive lined the staircase, and as they reached the midway point, the staircase moved into an open underground factory that had been modified. It was immense, and from the wrought iron staircase you could see vast amounts of people, all busying themselves along the factory floor. Arissa and Fade wasted no time in traversing the factory and heading deeper into what seemed like an endless labyrinth of passageways, tunnels, and newly opened up underground caverns. Finally, people! Fade eagerly ran his eyes over the numerous faces. He saw, and could not help but be happy. It was a refreshing sight to see. They went through a hydroponics area where food was being grown and transported, then inward even further, with no hesitation, to a closely guarded area. This must be where the children were. I was excited but distracted by Arissa's hastiness. The couple went up another staircase and into a makeshift hospital of sorts. Arissa asked a passing nurse, Where is Rock? The nurse gave him some quick information, and they turned some corners and came to a room with a clear glass window in it. Arissa and Fade looked through the glass and saw a man standing there with a mask on, concentrating on something. To his side there was a notepad that he was vigorously recording something on. Arissa pushed a button and said, "Hi, Doc. Long time." The man looked up, dropped what he was doing, and slowly took off his mask. He had a sideways grin on his face. "Arissa, is that you?" he said. The man was thin, scruffy, unshaven, and had an aged look on his face. He wore an old tattered lab coat, and his hair was a short, quickly combed, brownish-gray mess. He washed his hands as he watched and went into a halfway room between ours and the one we saw him in for detoxification. As the other door to our room opened, he came through it and looked at Arissa with a long, drawn-out stare. He opened his arms and rushed into her like a landslide. "We had all but given up your return," he exclaimed with a heavy German accent. Come, you must see," he eagerly barked. Then he saw Fade. His eyes examined him like a doctor would. Orissa looked also, hoping he wouldn't see his different and disguised appearance, but halfway anticipating that he would. After a few minutes, he said, "Who is this? Or should I say what?" Orissa immediately grabbed the upper arm of Rock and said, "This is the reason I have come back. You need to talk to him. His name is Fade." Rock approached Fade and asked him some questions. As he did so, Rock noticed the paint on his skin as he pinched it to check its elasticity. "So you aren't one of us," his chin raised to see into the socket of one of the Fade's eyes. "But you aren't one of them either. I will need some blood," said the anxious doctor. I may be able to help, Doctor," Fade explained. "Cellular biology is a hobby of mine." "Is that the Titan 8300 microscope?" Impressed by his apparent knowledge of his equipment, Rock replies, "Why, yes it is. A bit old, but still in fine working condition." "What do you know about cellular biology?" Everything up to 50 years ago," Fade answered. Confused but satisfied by Fade's answer, the doctor then asked Orissa where she had found Fade. Orissa pulled the doctor aside. She told Fade to stay in the lab and that she would be right back. Orissa and Rock went into the adjacent room where Fade and Orissa had first viewed the doctor. She told Rock that she found Fade right outside ground zero of the plague and explained the situation and what they had experienced and seen since she had found him. "Is he a pure strain?" the doctor asked. "This is for you to find out," Orissa stated. The doctor thought for a moment and then told Orissa what to do. "You must bring this to the city keepers. They will want to confirm your findings and ready yourselves. I will notify them of your arrival. I will stay here with Fade and learn what I can," Rock said. Orissa left and headed for the city center to notify the keepers. A band of soldiers tasked for the task of keeping the city safe in the city center, and 7 keepers sat at one long table. The room was dimly lit, and the little light there was concentrated over the keepers and the small area in front of them. Orissa walked through the guarded hallway to the city center, glancing from one edge of the room to the other, and stopped and stood in front of the keepers. It had been some time since she had been there. "Orissa," one of them yelled, "you are not allowed." "Hear me, please, keepers. I bring urgent news. The city is in danger. Right now, an army of the dead are moving towards your city. 9 days south of are a countless number of unliving headed for Flint," Orissa stated. "Preposterous," one of the keepers announced. "We have lived behind the sanctity of these walls for 2 decades now. We are safe," Orissa argued. "Then send out scouts if you doubt me. In 9 days, this city will be infested with the dead." Meanwhile, back in the lab, Rock and Fade were examining some of Fade's blood. As they did so, Rock filled in Fade of his research so far. Rock said, "We started by examining specimens of the infected that were harmless, like arms and other body parts. The virus doesn't break down the body as a normal virus does, but rather it replaced cellular structure with a type of mimic. It was only at the atomic level that I could tell the difference. These viral automatons became like factories, slowly replacing all the cells in the body until there is no memory left and pure instinct takes over," Fade asked. "The instinct of the person?" Rock answered, "No, the instinct of the virus. It needs to reproduce. It does this in 2 ways, by regenerating and by infecting the uninfected." The understanding of the virus quickly became apparent to Fade. They are difficult to kill because they have reproductive, regenerative cells all over their entire bodies. One part doesn't need the next to function. Fade inquired, "How do you explain the longevity of their lifespan?" "Oxygen," Rock replies. "Well, not enough to sustain them due to the small amount of air exposure to the skin cells. Air will keep them alive for decades without feeding," Rock added. Fade's mind was racing. Why did they die with a blow to the head or shot to the brain? He knew the answer before he had finished asking the question. The brain controls the mouth, and the mouth is the area used to process regenerative materials. It was all making sense now. There was an itching in the back of Fade's mind, a question he was afraid to ask, even himself, because of what it might mean. The undead and the passage he had read in the old logbook he had found in the military base, specifically the last entry, subjects are hostile. They were not hostile to Fade. Doc Rock looked at Fade. Don't be afraid, he said. You are just different. Somehow, your mind was able to stop the progressive of the virus. Perhaps the electric shock you sustained during the lightning strike, your cells, in turn, now use the virus to reproduce without affecting your mind. In either case, your blood runs slightly colder like theirs. That explained the skin pigmentation. It seems that your virus has mutated to be able to use water as well, though it is not an alternative, more like a stopgap. Back in the city center, after some time the keepers agreed to send out scouts on bikes. All the bikes ran silent because of the modifications to electric power. Arissa stood in the middle of the city center before the keepers. They turned their attention to her. You see, years ago, Arissa had been Rock's assistant. They were given the task of trying to cure the plague. Arissa's independent nature made it very difficult to follow rules, and despite Rock's best efforts, an incident caused Arissa to disagree with the Keeper's course of action on the subject. She defied the Keeper Council, and before the Council could act on her disobedience, Arissa disappeared. Now that she had returned, she would be punished, and she knew it. The head of the Keeper Council, a strict and emotionless man named Dowd, verbally directed Arissa, "For your crime, you will be put in the holding cell area until we can decide what your punishment will be." Arissa calmly followed the guards to her cell and sat there, waiting in frustration. After several hours of examination yielding no results, Rock and Fade began to wonder where Arissa had gone. Rock had picked up the phone and dialed the city center. The city was able to create an interconnected phone system with the existing phone lines and convert it to a closed system. As Rock asked about Arissa, Fade could see the distressed look in his face. Fade knew that something had happened. Rock got off the phone and told Fade the details. The council would not decide Arissa's fate. Fade couldn't help but feel responsible. After all, she had brought him there despite the now obvious danger she had put herself in. When Rock and Fade were approaching the city center, Rock requested that Fade wait outside the city center for him. The keepers didn't know Fade, and his appearance might lead to some problems. Outside the city center was the keeper's guard post, a barracks and headquarters of defense for the city. Soldiers could be seen headed from one area to the next doing drills and laser rifle practice. It was a large dome-shaped area that seemed to have been carved out for the keeper's use. The city center was a column in the middle of the dome that supported its peak. On the outskirts of the guards' practice arena, there were children playing and watching the soldiers perform their drills. It was fenced to keep the children out and the soldiers focused. Inside the center, Rock pleaded to the council for Arissa's release and was getting nowhere. Dowd was a stubborn old leader with little memory of the world as it was before. He put the safety of his city before all other matters. This was a good thing. He had kept the city safe. But in the case of Arissa, Rock was finding that until the council made a decision on the punishment for Arissa, dependent on the scout's return, she would stay where she was. As Rock and Dowd reached a conclusion to their conversation, Rock turned to leave the council's chambers. When Dowd asked aloud, "Who is the traveler that was with Arissa?" Rock slowly turned, and with a look of fear in his eyes that he quickly hid from Dowd, Rock responded, "He saved her from a band of scavengers." Dowd replied, "Did you think we wouldn't notice a fresh face in our city?" Rock replied, "Sirs, he was alone, and is very well versed in cellular biology. I can use him to continue my research. He is a sample of pure strain." The council had long since given up the chance for a cure for the disease, but the keepers knew that hope was a valuable tool and kept Rock's research going because they knew that Rock gave the people their city that hope. Very well, the boy can stay, but he will be your responsibility. And put in your care, Doctor, Dowd announced. Rock graciously bowed out of the chambers. Outside of the city center chambers, Rock grabbed Fade to direct him to the path back to the laboratory sector. He explained that what had happened, and that they would have to wait until the council decides on the punishment for Orissa. The council was usually quite swift with their decisions, but in this case, Rock hoped that they would take a bit of time discussing, only because when the scouts return and it is found that Orissa's put the city's fate above her own, they may be more lenient. Fade and